The fall. He let himself slip off the edge, sliding into the unknown, dropping into nothingness. As he fell, he drew himself up into a ball and allowed his body to spin. With his knees tucked into his chest and touching his chin, he fell, spinning faster and faster. He began to black out as the spinning increased, so for a second he extended his legs and arms in the star position before resuming the ball. Still he fell, the side of the cliff flashing past him, the other fallers falling in front, behind, beside, and all around him. They fell together, each with their own style, some twisting, others diving, still others falling feet first with arms outstretched. Memories of his final days before the ceremony of the great fall filled his mind as he continued to fall. The elders had addressed all the young men and women, the firstborn in their families, who had reached the age to fall. It was a great honour, the elders had said, to be a firstborn, to be chosen from the moment of conception. To be one of the fallers was to be a very special person. From time immemorial, they said, the ancestors had chosen the firstborn to be the ones who would fall. The law was the same for every family, so that wealth, learning, gender or physical health did not determine the choice. Only birth order did. Therefore it had been decreed that when the firstborn reached the age of initiation, they were to be prepared for their fall. The preparation involved being trained by certain elders, the young men by the male elders, and the young women by the female elders. It was a basic tenet of their society that everything was just and equal. As a result, there was precisely the same number of male and female elders who directed the affairs of the people. These elders chose the fallers individually to mentor them. The mentoring involved intense meditation to learn how to control the mind and deepen inner self-discipline so that fallers would not lose their reason as they fell. The elders also imparted all that was known about the fall itself. In truth, this was almost nothing, since nobody had ever returned from the fall. No messages had ever been received from those who fell, and no one could see the land below that the fallers fell towards, since it was always concealed by clouds and mist. What the elders spoke of in their mentoring sessions as a result were the beliefs about what happened to those who fell. It was thought that they entered the world of the dead as princes and princesses, royal rulers of the shadows. Since the dead were cast over the edge into the depths, to fall dead into the next world, it was logical that the fallers themselves, the elders explained, were especially blessed. They did not die, they fell. Each mentor spent a great deal of time with his or her mentee, discussing what they would take with them in their fall. The dead were dropped off the edge with items that relatives decided would be useful for them in their new life in the shadows below the clouds. It was a holy task, consequently, for each faller to choose what he or she would take with them in their fall. Some chose family memorabilia, others tokens from friends, and a very few specific articles that would be of practical use in the life to come after the fall. Whatever was selected had to fit within the life pouch, the small pocket bag attached to the belt that each faller wore. He touched his life pouch as he fell, reminded of its contents. He had decided to take a knife, one made by his father and blessed by his mentor. It was small, but beautifully crafted and extremely sharp. His mentor had said that such a choice would suggest that he would be a mighty warrior after he completed his fall and entered the world below the clouds. He would be a leader of the dead. The tiny knife in this world would become a mighty sword in the next, a weapon transformed by the honour and majesty of the fall into a magical device bringing dignity to its wielder. He continued to fall, and realized that he and the other fallers were entering the clouds. Misty, damp air rushed past him, brushing his face and hands. In a matter of seconds he could see nothing except the white, wispy, wet air moving around him. This was the level of the spirits who received the dead and assessed them before they were permitted to continue to the next world. The spirits did not weigh up the lives of the fallers, however, because the fallers were blessed. His mentor had assured him repeatedly that he had nothing to fear from the spirits of the clouds. If anything, they would be likely to praise the fallers and welcome them. He saw no spirits, however, only more of the strange, moving clouds. Perhaps these were the spirits, he thought to himself. Were they actually honouring him as he fell, by surrounding, encircling and embracing him? Was this the spirits dancing in celebration of the fallers, welcoming them into the world of the dead? He wondered what the other fallers were thinking as they fell amongst these strange cloud creatures. There was no sound other than the rushing of the air around his body. He tried to look into the air around him, straining to see any of the other fallers, but none were in sight. He was alone. Unwanted thoughts forced their way into his mind, that he had been rejected by the spirits, and this was why he was all alone. All the other fallers had been welcomed, and he had been rejected, found wanting because of his relationship with another faller, Urine, which was strictly forbidden. Guilt, terror and horror flooded his mind. He nearly screamed. Then he remembered his mental preparation and tried to reassert inner control. These thoughts were only that, thoughts, and thoughts were merely projections of the mind which could be harnessed. Suddenly he was out of the clouds. The shock was massive. He could see again, and see so much. There were other fallers all around him, some further away, but some really quite close. He wanted to look down, but he remembered his training and began the prayer of entry into the lower world, now that he had been accepted by the spirits. O Lord of the upper and lower worlds, I thank thee that thou hast caused me to be welcomed by the spirits, so that I might enter into my inheritance as a faller. Welcome me into your lower world, and help me to be full of gratitude to thee as I receive all that thou hast prepared for me. Having completed the prayer, he felt reassured inside and worthy of what was ahead of him. He extended his body to slow his fall and looked towards the other fallers. He wondered if Urine was nearby, and if she had been accepted as he had. One of the fallers nearest to him was a young woman, and she smiled at him, her long hair sweeping up behind her, flapping violently. This surprised him, because mentors told fallers to cut their hair short, so that it would not be a distraction as they fell. There was also a religious dimension to this principle. The spirits of the clouds did not approve of long hair, because they considered it to be a sign of a lack of self-discipline. And yet this young woman had some of the longest hair he had ever seen. How had she managed to get this far with such hair? It did not make sense to him. As he slowed his descent, the girl nearby directed herself towards him, so that within a matter of seconds they were next to each other, and she grasped his right hand with her left. She was shouting, but he could not hear what she was saying. Her face was full of life and joy, he thought, as if she was bursting with energy. She pointed to another faller, a young man nearby but above them, and signalled to him to join them as they fell. He recognized this lad as Joran, a large, heavily built young man who had never been very friendly. Joran drew in his limbs so that he increased his speed of descent, and as he was passing them, the girl reached out with her free hand and grabbed him. Joran did not look as happy as the girl, and nor was he as adept as her at this new form of gymnastics as they fell. Even so, with the girl screaming words that neither of them could hear, and gesticulating wildly with her legs, since both her hands were engaged, they eventually completed the circle of 3, so that they were all holding the other's left hand. They fell like this, as a threesome, for some time, or so it seemed. The small formation they had become was sometimes mentioned by the elders and mentors. 3 was a sacred number, and 3 fallers together was believed to be spiritually significant. It implied unity and power. Other fallers passed them by as they continued to fall. There were still individual fallers, but he noticed a number of threesomes within the limits of his vision above and around them. He maintained his obedience to the great law of not looking below after passing through the spirit level. He remembered the words of his mentor. To cast even a momentary glance below and to stare at the lower world as you fall is to condemn yourself to an eternal fall, a fall that will never end, so that you will be lost to existence, doomed to non-existence, rotting and decaying in your fall, hopeless and lifeless. He shivered, even as he remembered those words. They still terrified him. He was shocked, therefore, to see the young girl staring down below her, shouting once more. He frowned at her, signalling his refusal to look down by shaking his head. Joran simply stared ahead as if nothing was happening, or looked up, an empty expression on his face. Suddenly something huge and dark and moving very fast swept by them. The slipstream bounced their threesome, throwing them around like leaves in the breeze. They spun, and he was unable to hold onto the girl's hand as they were thrown apart. Joran's grip was stronger, and the 2 men were able to maintain their connection, even though they started to spin violently, completely out of control. He tried to slow their spin, and so did Joran. Little by little they regained control, and were able to settle into a classic twosome, falling in a controlled manner. He saw the young woman spinning alone, her hair spreading out behind like water gushing from her head. She had lost all balance and stability in her fall. She had entered the spins, that terrifying situation out of which only the most capable of fallers could extricate themselves. As her arms and legs flailed about, she slowed down ever so slightly and slipped above the twosome, but some distance from them. They could both see the look of terror on her face, and her eyes beginning to retract upwards as she neared unconsciousness. Then she was gone. A massive flying creature with claws, an extended beak and wings that seemed to reach across the sky, snatched her away. Other flying monsters glided through the fallers, plucking them one by one, whisking them off to a living death in their talons or cruel beaks. Instinctively, he let go of Joran and formed himself into the arrow, his arms tucked to his side, his legs tightly together, his head pointed down, his eyes firmly shut to prevent him seeing the lower world. He felt himself falling faster, the air roaring past his ears, battering his head and face. He heard the great monsters of the air shrieking, and felt one sweep by him very close, but none seized him as he feared, and he continued to fall. Soon he could no longer hear the giant predators, nor feel their presence through the air, so he pulled in his legs and swung his body so that he could look upwards, his fall slowing with the increasing air resistance. Once he was certain he could see no winged beast, he extended his whole body to slow himself down as much as possible. There were still fallers around and above him, falling in different positions, but alive. With the immediate threat of those creatures having abated, he relaxed enough to sense that the air was becoming warmer and more humid. He felt it in his nose and mouth and on his face. The atmosphere was different. It was not the cold, clear air of the settlements, but another world altogether. Was this the lower world? Had he been accepted after all and found worthy? Two fallers drew near to him, wanting to form a new threesome. Two women, with the customary short hair, manoeuvred towards him. As he slowed down, he seemed to rise up to them. They clasped hands and fell as a team of three. None of them smiled, each too overwhelmed by thoughts of the trauma of the aerial predators or what might be below them. He could see other threesomes forming as well, with a few individual fallers also in sight. The numbers were drastically smaller than before the flying monstrosities had made their appearance, but still there were fallers, and his spirits lifted as a result. He became aware of something else also. For the first time he could make out a new rock wall opposite the one he had fallen from. This was completely new. It shocked him. What was happening? How could there be a wall of rock opposite him, as well as behind him? The world he was told he would be entering should have no limits and no ending. What did this mean? He gestured with his head in the direction of the new cliff, and the two girls nodded with expressions of total ignorance. Trees and bushes on ledges of this new rock face flashed past them, and he even made out what he thought was a goat pulling on some grass. And then they hit water. The impact was so intense that he blacked out. The momentum of his descent thrust him deep into the water, so deep that the temperature dropped significantly, and this brought him round as he was still slipping lower and lower. He kicked his legs and pushed himself upwards against the force of his fall. His lungs felt like they would explode, but he pulled himself up with as much energy as he could. He could see the light above him, the surface calling to him, and yet he felt that he would die. His strength was waning, and his desire to breathe almost overwhelming. As he was about to expire, a massive dark shape rammed into him and thrust him upwards, so that he was thrown out of the water and into the air before crashing back into the water once more. Other fallers broke the surface in a similar manner around him, flying erratically, limbs wheeling, eyes crazy with horror as they spun back into the water. He hit the water hard, but soon resurfaced, desperately trying to gain control of his situation and understand what was happening to him and the other fallers. Coughing and spluttering, he saw fallers being bounced out of the water, either being allowed to splash back into the water or being caught in great teeth-filled jaws. There were cries, screams, and the sounds of crunching bones. The water was turning red, and it almost seemed to boil, so disturbed was it by the powerful movements of the creatures that played with the fallers. Suddenly something smashed into him again and thrust him into the air once more. As he spun, he saw the horrific scene of fallers being torn to pieces in the water below him. He expected to be caught in the jaws of one of the terrible water monsters that were consuming his people as he fell back into the water. However, 3 monstrous dark forms opened their jaws to catch him, and in doing so they crashed into each other, with the result that they all missed him as he splashed down. The 3 monsters fought each other, not even remembering their prey, the water exploding around them. One of their tails swept him violently out of the water and fast and low, away from the desperate war of survival. He was flung into the shallows where, for a moment, he was compelled to catch his breath as he coughed and spluttered. Pulling himself up, he dragged his battered body towards what he now recognized as dry land. He could see rocks, grass, bushes and trees through his watery eyes, and he stumbled forwards. A great crash behind him was a reminder of the horror that he was trying to escape, and he pushed himself with what little energy he had left towards what he hoped was safety. He passed the half-eaten body of a faller, both legs and one arm missing, the empty eyes staring upwards as if looking back to where he came from. Even the rocks and stones at the edge of the water were splattered with blood and human remains. He wanted to vomit, but he was too exhausted to do so, and he stumbled on. The sounds of death gradually receded as he found himself in some long grass and low bushes. "This way, please, just over here," someone called out. He could hardly make out the speaker. His eyes were so full of water, and it crossed his mind that perhaps they had been damaged by his fall and the impact of the water. Would he ever be able to see clearly again? He felt a blanket being put over his shoulders and a warm hand grasping his own. This way, just follow me. We are here. You are the 5th today. Some days none of the fallers survive, but 5 in one day is unusual." He allowed himself to be led through the grass and bushes towards the tallest trees he had ever seen. Once amongst the trees he was sat down. His eyes were starting to clear, and he realized he was sitting next to a fire that crackled nearby. "Warm yourself. It will take time for you to recover," a voice declared from around him. "The trauma of the fall is great. Some never recover in their minds. We are the survivors." "Why? Why? Why?" was all he could say. "Why? Why? Why?" He started screaming, thrashing, rolling around on the floor of pine needles so that they had to hold him down.